The sun hung low over the weathered town of Elder Spring, casting long shadows as a frail figure shuffled into the local courthouse. His hands were restrained, and the weight of years was etched deeply into his sunken face. "State your name," the clerk droned, barely glancing up from her papers. With a quiver in his voice, he replied, "Gideon Hale, former corporal, Royal British Army." The room fell into a hush, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Minutes later, as Judge Margaret Hastings shuffled through the case file, her fingers froze mid-page. The name struck her like a thunderclap. It was the name of the man who had once pulled her brother to safety during a skirmish in Afghanistan, only to disappear into the shadows of life afterward. Gideon Hale, 68, sat hunched on the courtroom bench, his broad shoulders appearing smaller beneath a battered military jacket that hung loosely on his frame. Under the clinical lights, every crease in his face told tales of battles fought, both external and internal. Once a figure of pride in his crisp uniform, he now awaited judgment in the remnants of a life long since discarded. "Case 18D, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the austere walls. "Town of Elder Spring versus Gideon Hale. The charges: public disturbance, unlawful entry, resisting arrest." He stood slowly, joints creaking under the burden of time and old injuries. First in the Falklands, then in the deserts of Iraq. His scars were invisible to most, worn beneath a lifetime of silence. "Mr. Hale," the prosecutor began, his youthful demeanor clashing with the gravity of the moment, "you've been warned repeatedly about loitering near the Hearthside Café. The owner has lodged multiple complaints this month. What he didn't disclose was that Gideon never begged or harassed patrons. He simply sought solace near the café's back vent, trying to glean warmth from the approaching winter chill." Then came the testimony from the arresting officer, who recounted finding Gideon behind the café at 10:15 p.m. Refusing to leave when ordered. Gideon hadn't refused. He had merely asked for a few minutes to finish a sandwich given to him by an empathetic chef, but his words were lost in the noise of the court. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "this marks his third offense this year. We recommend 30 days of community service and a barring order from the downtown area. Such an order would prevent Mr. Hale from accessing the local shelter, effectively leaving him out in the cold during the harshest months." "Mr. Hale," Judge Hastings finally interjected, her gaze piercing through her glasses, "do you have legal representation today?" He shook his head. His public defender had been pulled into another case. "Would you like to defend yourself?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. Gideon cleared his throat, the words scraping against the walls of his heart. "No excuses, Your Honor. Just needed shelter from the cold." "Why that location?" the judge pressed, her expression unreadable, though a hint of concern crept into her voice. He hesitated, the memories swirling in his mind. "Sean, the chef, knows me. His father served with me in Iraq. He leaves food for those in need." "And your service?" she prodded, her curiosity momentarily breaking decorum. "Royal British Army, Corporal," Gideon answered, straightening slightly. "Served from 74 to 92, Afghanistan and Iraq." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, decades of unacknowledged pride clamoring to be heard. Judge Hastings made a quick note, her brow furrowing as she considered the implications of his service. Just then, the courthouse doors swung open. A distinguished man in a tailored charcoal suit entered with purpose, his presence commanding immediate attention. He approached the defense table, placing his briefcase down. "Your Honor, I'm Nathaniel Brooks. I've just been retained to represent Mr. Hale. I apologize for the sudden appearance." Gideon turned, bewildered. He hadn't sought an attorney. He couldn't afford one, especially not a man with polished shoes and an air of authority. "This is unusual," Judge Hastings remarked, her eyes scrutinizing. The court was not informed of new representation. It was a last-minute arrangement. Brooks replied, maintaining his composure. "I respectfully request a brief recess to confer with my client." The judge regarded them both intently. her face a mask of neutrality. "This court will recess for 15 minutes," she declared before exiting to her chambers. Gideon leaned toward the newcomer. "I can't pay for this," Brooks replied softly. "You won't need to. Our firm is taking this on pro bono." Gideon's brow furrowed at the name. "Brooks." "Yes, my mother and the judge are old friends," Brooks confirmed. In her office, Judge Hastings pulled off her glasses, her hands trembling slightly. 2 decades on the bench had instilled in her a sense of control. But nothing had prepared her for this revelation. "It can't be the same man," she murmured, though the evidence was irrefutable. She retrieved an old photograph from her desk, a younger version of herself, beaming alongside her brother, Lieutenant Robert Hastings, in his military uniform. Next to the photo lay Robert's final letter from Afghanistan, its edges frayed from years of sorrow. In it, he recounted a harrowing firefight. His unit had been pinned down, but then came Corporal Hale, braving the gunfire, dragging a wounded soldier to safety, covering the retreat as others rescued the injured. "If it weren't for him," Robert had written, "we would have never made it." Just weeks after that letter, Robert was killed in action. Margaret recalled her brother's funeral, the folded flag, her family's silent anguish, and the soldier who approached afterward. "Your brother saved my life," he had said, his voice heavy with unspoken grief. The name had lingered in her mind. Gideon Hale. Years had passed since she tried to find him, hoping to learn more about her brother's final moments. But the military had informed her that he'd been redeployed shortly after. Later, they said he'd been discharged with severe PTSD and a traumatic brain injury. Now, 2 decades later, he sat in her courtroom, a ghost of the man she had once known. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Brooks stepped inside, concern etched on his face. "Margaret, what is happening here?" As her late husband's former law partner and lifelong family friend, he was one of the few who dared to address her by name. "It's him, Nathaniel," she whispered, motioning to the photograph. "The one who saved Robert, the man who brought him back." Brooks's expression shifted as realization dawned. "The homeless veteran in your courtroom." Brooks paused, his voice dropping. "Gideon Hale, the same man you've been searching for." Margaret nodded. "His military records confirm it. Afghanistan 2006, same unit as Robert. He received the Military Cross for the very act Robert described in his letters. Does he know who you are?" "I doubt it. I took my husband's last name after law school. It's been 20 years. Hale wouldn't recognize me now." She inhaled deeply, struggling against the tide of emotions. "How does a hero end up like this, Nathaniel? How does someone who once saved lives find himself on trial for simply trying to stay warm?" Brooks shook his head. "In the brief time I spoke with him, I sensed he's faced more than most can bear. PTSD after deployment. His wife left while he was overseas, his benefits tangled in bureaucracy. He worked construction until his injuries made it impossible. Then came job loss, eviction, and eventually the streets." Margaret closed her eyes. Robert's words echoed in her memory. "Gideon was the best of us, the kind of soldier who would risk everything for his brothers. I hope to be half the man he was. Nathaniel, you could recuse yourself. No one would question it." "No," she replied resolutely. "I refuse to let this man slip away again." "Margaret, there are ethical risks involved. I'm aware," she stated, straightening her posture. "But we have a moral obligation to those who have sacrificed everything for this country." When Judge Hastings returned to the courtroom, her demeanor was unyielding, her voice steady. Those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she organized her papers. "Mr. Brooks," she began formally, "has your client made a decision?" Brooks stood, his expression serious. "Yes, Your Honor. We are requesting the dismissal of all charges. Mr. Hale was not trespassing. He was merely seeking refuge from the frigid temperatures, and we can prove that café staff allowed him to be there." The prosecutor opened his mouth to object, but Hastings raised a hand, silencing him. "I have questions for the defendant," she said, turning her focus to Gideon. Mr. Hale, your military file indicates your service in Afghanistan 2006. Is that correct? Gideon straightened, instinctively regaining a semblance of military posture. Yes, ma'am. 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. And on March 15th, were you involved in an operation near Helmand Province? Confusion crossed Gideon's weathered face. Yes, ma'am. We were escorting a convoy when we were ambushed. During that firefight, she pressed. Did you rescue a fellow soldier? Lieutenant Robert Hastings, while under enemy fire. A hush enveloped the courtroom. Gideon's eyes narrowed, the name igniting a flood of memories. Hastings, he murmured. Yes, brave lad. Took a hit trying to save another. His voice drifted, heavy with nostalgia. I reached him, pulled him behind a wall. He kept insisting I leave him to help the others, but I couldn't abandon him. In the gallery, a silver-haired veteran in a military jacket leaned forward. His interest piqued. And what happened to Lieutenant Hastings? Judge Hastings inquired, her composure faltering slightly. We got him out, Gideon responded softly. He was evacuated to Germany, but shortly afterward, his convoy hit an IED. I've carried that guilt with me ever since. Wondered if saving him only prolonged the inevitable. Before anyone could respond, the silver-haired veteran stood abruptly. That's him, he exclaimed, pointing. That's Corporal Hale. I was there. He saved so many that day. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Judge Hastings rapped her gavel once, commanding silence. Order, she called, though her voice lacked its usual authority. The room settled into a tense stillness. Gideon kept his gaze low, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden focus on him. The older veteran remained standing. Your Honor, he interjected. I don't mean to disrupt, but I was present that day. Hale took fire to pull that lieutenant out. The prosecutor interjected. Your Honor, while Mr. Hale's military service is commendable, it bears no relevance to these charges. Judge Hastings interjected sharply. The court disagrees. It is profoundly relevant. She placed her gavel down slowly. This court will recess for 10 minutes. Turning to the bailiff, she added, ensure Mr. Hale remains in the courtroom. Just as she began to leave her bench, she paused, a rare moment of vulnerability. Her eyes met Gideon's for the first time, truly met him. Mr. Hale, she said softly, when I return, there are matters far beyond this case that we need to discuss. In her chambers, the judge finally allowed her emotions to surface. She pressed trembling fingers against her lips, as if trying to contain 2 decades of buried sorrow. After a long breath, she reached for the phone. Colonel Hughes, it's Margaret Hastings. I know it's been a long time, but I need your assistance urgently. 10 minutes later, she returned to the courtroom, not alone. 3 soldiers followed her. Full colonel, a sergeant major, and a young corporal carrying a polished wooden case. Gasps rippled through the audience at the sight of their uniforms. Gideon instinctively stood, his posture straightening despite the stiffness in his joints. Judge Hastings took her place but set aside her glasses for the first time in her judicial career, addressing the courtroom not as a judge but as a sister. Before we proceed, she began, I must disclose a personal connection to this case. She turned to Gideon. Lieutenant Robert Hastings mentioned earlier. He was my brother. The crowd gasped collectively. Gideon's brow furrowed, recognition dawning in his eyes as the weight of the moment settled over them. 20 years ago, Margaret continued, my brother wrote home about a corporal who saved his life in Afghanistan. He said, this man ran through enemy fire, refusing to leave me behind. Her voice trembled, filled with emotion. That man was Corporal Gideon Hale. From the gallery, the earlier veteran stepped forward again. It's true, he affirmed. I witnessed it. Hale took rounds pulling that lieutenant to safety. Judge Hastings nodded, her voice unwavering. 2 weeks later, my brother was killed in action. At his funeral, several soldiers approached our family, speaking of Robert's bravery, but also of the man who gave us extra time with him. We would have never had. She looked directly at Gideon. After Robert's death, I sought you out, hoping to hear your story, but the military said you'd redeployed. Years later, I learned you'd been discharged, but no one could tell me where you had gone." Gideon was silent. Every emotion flickered across his weathered face. "I never stopped searching," she said. "And now, whether by fate or divine intervention, you stand before me." She signaled to Colonel Hughes. "This is Colonel Edward Hughes," she introduced. "He commanded my brother's unit. He has important news to share." Hughes stepped forward, his voice steady. "Corporal Hale," he began. "The military has been attempting to locate you for some time. Your file was part of a review under the Veterans Reassessment Initiative." He explained that new intelligence regarding your deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan warranted updates to both your commendations and benefits. The corporal beside him opened the wooden case in his arms. Inside lay a medal upon deep blue velvet. "By order of the Ministry of Defense," Colonel Hughes declared. "In recognition of extraordinary valor on March 15, 2006, the Military Cross is hereby awarded to Corporal Gideon Hale, Royal British Army." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The Military Cross, the second highest honor after the Victoria Cross. "Until recently, certain aspects of your mission were classified," Colonel Hughes continued. "But your actions that day didn't just save Lieutenant Hastings. They thwarted an ambush that could have decimated the entire convoy. Your commendation has been formally upgraded," he concluded. Gideon's jaw tightened. "There must be some mistake," he said quietly. "I merely did my duty." "No mistake, Corporal," the colonel affirmed, his voice resolute. "This recognition is long overdue." From the gallery, a voice rang out with authority. "Attention on deck." The silver-haired veteran stood at full attention, and others followed, soldiers, former officers, even civilians who understood the weight of sacrifice. One by one, they rose and saluted Gideon Hale. Soon, the entire room was on its feet. Even the prosecutor stood, torn between legal decorum and human decency. Judge Hastings, overwhelmed, wiped her eyes. Her voice shook as she spoke. "In light of these extraordinary developments, all charges against Corporal Gideon Hale are hereby dismissed permanently." She struck her gavel with conviction. "This court is adjourned." As the room began to settle, the sergeant major approached Gideon with a tablet in hand. "Sir, we've been trying to correct your military records. Your disability rating has now been reassessed. 100% service-connected. Retroactive to your original discharge date." Gideon blinked, taken aback. "What does that mean?" "It means you're entitled to full back pay, comprehensive medical coverage, housing assistance, educational benefits. Everything you need moving forward." Brooks stepped forward with determination. "Our firm will ensure every detail is processed. No more delays. No more red tape." From the back of the courtroom, Sean, the chef who had left food behind the café, stepped forward, tears gleaming in his eyes. "My dad always said," Sean began. "There was a soldier who saved his whole unit. He said, if you ever meet a man named Gideon Hale, you owe him everything." Sean extended a hand, emotions spilling forth. "I didn't know that man was you." "Not until today." The prosecutor, visibly moved, approached slowly. "Sir, I had no idea. Please accept my sincerest apologies for the handling of your case." Gideon stood tall amidst the rising tide of respect. The weight of decades finally lifted. One breath at a time, Judge Hastings stepped down from the bench, the distance evaporating. She stopped before him, her voice steady but filled with meaning. "My brother once told us what you said to him that day. No soldier gets left behind, not while I'm still breathing. Today, Corporal Hale, we finally uphold that promise to you." 2 weeks later, Gideon Hale stood before a mirror, adjusting to a life that felt surreal. He was in a humble apartment, part of a program designed specifically for veterans like him. The walls were bare, save for a single frame, a display of his newly awarded military cross, flanked by his long-lost commendations and service medals, all painstakingly recovered by Brooks. A knock jolted him from his thoughts. He opened the door to find Margaret Hastings, not in robes but as a friend, holding a small box. "May I come in, Corporal Hale?" she inquired. "Just Gideon is fine," he replied with a gentle smile. "Then it's just Margaret," she said, stepping inside. They sat across from each other in the modest living room, the weight of their shared past thickening the air. "I brought something," Margaret said, opening the box. Inside lay a bundle of aged letters, carefully tied together. "They're from Robert. He wrote us regularly while deployed." She handed one to Gideon. "This one mentions you. It's dated the day after you saved him." His hands trembled as he unfolded it. Robert's handwriting was as clear as he remembered. "Dear Mom and Dad," Gideon read aloud, "do not worry about the news. I am safe thanks to Corporal Hale. He did something yesterday I still cannot comprehend. When our unit was ambushed, he moved through enemy fire like it was nothing. He refused to leave me, even when I insisted he should. He said, 'No soldier gets left behind, not while I'm here.'" Gideon's voice wavered. "He wrote about you often," Margaret added quietly. "He spoke of you with great respect." "He was a good officer," Gideon replied, emotion thick in his throat. "So young, yet so devoted." Margaret glanced around the apartment. "After Robert died, I pursued law, establishing this Veterans Court program and the housing initiatives. It was all inspired by the stories he shared about the system neglecting its own." Gideon shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I simply did what needed to be done." "That's precisely what heroes always say," Margaret replied with a gentle smile. She hesitated before adding, "There's one more thing you should know. The day Robert died, he was leading a mission to find insurgents targeting civilians. He volunteered for the mission, and his last letter expressed his desire to live up to the example you set." That revelation hit Gideon harder than any battlefield wound. For 20 years, he had carried the burden of doubt, questioning whether saving Robert had only delayed the inevitable, if his sacrifice had even mattered. "He didn't die because of you," Margaret said softly, perceiving his internal struggle. "He lived the way he did because of you." They sat in silence, two lives intertwined by service and sorrow. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the town in a serene hush. Finally, Gideon spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "For years, I slept on sidewalks, convinced no one remembered, that none of it mattered anymore." Margaret nodded. "But it did," she assured him. "To Robert, to every soldier you saved, and to me." As she stood to leave, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Robert used to say the measure of a soldier isn't what he does in front of a crowd. It's what he accomplishes when no one is watching. You embodied that," she whispered. Even when the world turned away, Gideon stood taller than he had in years, a quiet strength radiating from within. "Someone remembered my name," he murmured. "After all this time, someone remembered." In that singular moment, something profound began to heal, not just within Gideon Hale, but for every soul forgotten by the nation they served. Some heroes save lives yet spend a lifetime waiting for someone to save theirs. But sometimes, dignity doesn't need a spotlight.